The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. When it comes to utility data, there's a common misconception that it's fixed and beyond your control. However, that's far from the truth. 360 Energy has created an innovative AI-powered platform designed to simplify and automate the complex process of energy and emissions data management. Introducing Envirely. Envirely provides organizations with a comprehensive solution enabling efficient management of energy usage, cost reduction, and greenhouse gas emissions reduction in alignment with global standards. Welcome back, Dave and John.
Really good to be back.
John, good to have you back. You missed a great session last week, but I'm happy to have
you here. Yeah. Well, let's make up for it this week.
Let's giddy up.
Well, today we have a really exciting episode because we're going to be talking about navigating energy management in corporate boardrooms. And I know Dave is super fired up about this, and John, I'm sure you're going to pull in some interesting facts as we go along. So to start off this episode, how has the recent emphasis on sustainability and environmental responsibility influenced the prioritization of energy as a controllable cost within corporations in C-suites?
I'll kick this off, John. Let me. So, Lysandra, your comment or question is, it should have an impact on the boardroom.
I would hope so.
My experience this year is it isn't. It's not. It's same old, same old. Like, we're going to delegate this back to someone from sustainability. I came back from a conference last week on EV and charging 2024. And there's exceptions, to be clear. And we've actually interviewed a couple people on that. The Purelator's exceptions. Certainly Staple seems to be an exception where the senior management are on board and actually actively involved in the whole process. But from the view of what I saw and people I spoke to, it's been delegated. Again, like, for example, if I'll use the EV, it's a fleet thing. So fleet, you take care of this. It's not, from my view. And I think why I'm so keen on this episode is that we've been talking to people like Tom Rand and others, and we know the work that John and I do, that the only way you move the dial is that senior management have to be actively involved. And I'm talking about from the C-suite to the board. And when I say actively involved, that doesn't mean, yeah, let's do it, and then never look at the file again. That means, yes, we're going to do it. We're going to set targets. We're going to set goals, and we're going to measure it, and we're going to see how effective we are. Oh, and by the way, maybe part of our performance in the C-suite is impacted on what the organization does. And I think personally, we're pretty far from that from my experience here in North America. John, love to hear your input in Europe.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Lysandra's question has the recent emphasis on sustainability.
Yes.
I mean, I think we've joked about this before, but Dave and I, certainly, we were doing sustainability before it was popularly called sustainability. But we used to have corporate social responsibility. That's morphed into environment, social and governance, ESG reporting, and we've got net zero has come in. So ESG and net zero are the big pressures at the moment. And I look at this from work I've done in the past and work I've done recently. I've been involved in the limited assurance of ESG reporting for a number of large organisations. And what I'm worried about is that we are at the moment, the emphasis is all about reporting and producing a report that's transparent, it meets all those requirements. It's also about the drive to set targets. Now, everybody knows that if you're trying to be popular today in the sustainability world, you're going to have to say we will be net zero brackets, whatever that means, close brackets, by 2050. Well, that's easy. But it's interesting. A lot of organisations are going for targets in between that, which is absolutely essential, because I was in a session yesterday where somebody was saying, what's the problem with 2050 targets? And that is, well, we've set that target. Okay, let's put that to one side. Now let's carry on with what we're doing. It will be on somebody else's watch when the 2050 target comes up. So we've got that kind of thing there. But we are at the moment really being driven by this reporting. And I'm going to say the experience I have is often the people who are involved in doing the reporting are not involved in moving the dial. And this is where we've got two disconnects. We've got one is it's all about reporting. Now, I know the theory is that year on year, suddenly, oh, the figures aren't moving. Perhaps we should be doing something, but you should be thinking about that before you get there. And the other one is, and I'm sorry to say this, even though we know that the exploration and use of energy is the major contribution to carbon emissions, so many people have not made the correct link between energy use and CO2 emissions. And they've not made the other link is that let's not even think about net zero. Doing something about energy is good business sense because normally good energy management saves you money. So yes, there is this emphasis, and I'm going to, yeah, I think it's too much focused on marketing, outward looking good, as opposed to actually restructuring and developing the organisation.
Well said, John. I want to add another piece that I think, and another famous word now is transition or transformation,
Yes.
right? And again, it's my personal belief. Just take us out of the account that we're in the energy business. But the way the world's going, this transition, whether it's net zero, whatever it is, it's happening. And we've said this a number of times. I've said it a few times on the podcast. Organizations that actually don't take action or don't take action quicker than others will lose out. They will be behind, and it could be catastrophic where they would possibly lose clients. It could be where it's taken them so long that the cost or the lineup of making the change. So we're even talking about EVs. We're now talking about, and it's early days still for medium to large transport. But now that we have people who have been on the podcast who have said, look, it takes me now a year or 2 years for the utility to bring more electrical load to my location. Now, these are early adopters. These are people that are early at the game. And so utilities are challenged to try to keep them. And it's not just going to be utilities, it's going to be equipment suppliers. They'll all be challenged. So where I'm going is the sooner you plan, and it has to come from the executive. It has to be seen by the executive. This is a requirement that we need to do. It can't be seen as a transaction. Then and only then will organizations take action. And as you said it, I'm going to call out just like you. I think it's just marketing. It's just saying they're doing it. And the truth is, people like you and I look under the hood. It takes us 5 minutes and you go, there's nothing here. Like there is nothing here.
Yeah.
Right?
I think the other thing we have to be aware of is what I call the free ride that some people take. Now, this will depend on where you are. But for example, if I've in the UK and I've got an all electric business, I actually can sit back and do nothing and see that business decarbonise over time. Because we are going through a major transition with our grid. We've sort of halved the carbon intensity, and we're going to go further with that. So I could sit there as an all electric business and say, I don't need to do anything, when it comes round to scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, the direct emissions and the indirects that you're controlling, because it's happening through the grid. So
right. And again, you're bringing up a very good point. That might help out on carbon emissions, but actually, have you actually optimized your electrical cost?
Exactly. Yeah. And that's where there is a disconnect. But I think we're going to probably come round to that in a later question. Yeah,
You
just
two
having had a
always beat
sneak,
me to it.
having had a sneak preview.
Well, on that note, what are some common misconceptions or barriers that prevent organizations from effectively managing and controlling their energy costs, and how can these challenges be overcome?
What an unexpected
You want to
question.
go, John? Yeah. Where
Okay,
did that come from?
yeah, I I think that there are a number, and I think it depends to an extent in what industry you're in. So I think, as always, we should say this with the things that Dave and I are saying, we're using a lot of generalizations. There are a lot of corporations who are really out there, really doing good, and Dave's mentioned a couple. What we're talking about is the general background that there is there. I think there is, and there has been for a long time, a general misconception that energy is not controllable, that it's a given. The same way that you're in, let's say you're in an office building, you know you've leased it, you're going to have to pay the rent. That's there, that's it. You're going to have to pay local taxes because you're a business there. That's it. You're going to have to pay insurance. Yeah, yeah. And you're going to have to pay for the energy. Oh, right, that's got all those overheads and things out the way. Now, what do we do as a business? Now, of course, that becomes really different if you're in a energy intensive manufacturing environment. But that's part of the problem of, do we put enough effort in to manage energy? Do we understand it? I mean, that there's a whole load of other elements come there. But I think there is a misconception about that. One, there's nothing we can do about it. Then the other one is, we can only do something about it if we spend lots of money. And eventually it might come round to, why don't we look at this strategically like we do any other aspect of the business and find out what the options are? And that's where we need to be.
Okay, I'm going to pick up on this, what you said, John. Invariably, energy, if you look at a P&L statement, it's very hard to find energy on that statement. It's hard to segregate. Like it's hidden in some of the items listed. So one, because that's not seen, it's not understood. And again by the senior executive, right? Two, historically, if you're looking at purchasing energy, they'll rely on finance or procurement, purchasing the energy. If they're looking at reducing consumption, they'll focus on engineering, maybe operations, but typically engineering and maintenance. John, I'll be interested what your thoughts are. But from my experience, those two parties work in silos and they don't talk to each other. When in actual fact, to do both of the things really well, if you're procuring energy, you should know how much you use. And if you're trying to reduce efficiency, you should understand the pricing signals. And that's never done,
Okay.
ever done. So it's treated as a transaction, right?
Yeah. Okay.
You wanted
So
to step in there, John.
yeah, I was going to pick up on that. You take the ISO 50001, which is the standard for energy management. Okay. It's got one clause in it about procurement. That's it. And yet, what we're talking about, if we were talking about buying raw material, if we were talking about buying steel, we wouldn't just talk about, oh, we only look at how many tons we buy. We'd be saying, how many tons do we buy? What does it cost? Where do we get it from? We would look at it in much more depth. So I think that's a point there. And I think the other point as well that comes in with this, you're saying, oh, procurers do one thing and solutions are with engineering. The other problem is with energy is, if you've got a department head and they got 20 people working for them, they are responsible for that level of human resource. Are they responsible for the energy that's used for that department or whatever? Typically they aren't, for a variety of reasons, and sometimes it's not practical. But you sometimes find that you will delve into an organisation and you will find that there is nobody, the wrong people, if you like, are accountable or responsible for the energy spent. And if the wrong
Yep.
people are responsible for it, nothing happens.
Yes. Yes. I'm going to go off of what you just said, John. I at this conference, I met with a municipal player that John, that you and I know in the
Yeah,
past, and so I can't give names of the organization. This particular person is actively involved in the energy front. And he has conveyed to me, because they have all the tools for data collection and analytics. He goes, we focus on capital, we never look at operational. And in fact, he goes, I did a study over Christmas time where no one was in the offices, because it's a big organization.
yeah,
And he found, like, I think 9 out of 11 major facilities, there was no change to the energy pattern when people were away for 2 weeks. No change, because no one is responsible for operating costs, coming back to your point. And I know for our listeners, that's a big area of focus that we try to do. We make departments involved, responsible. That's not done. Again, and the reason why it's not done, senior management doesn't make them aware or accountable for that action, right?
There's a few things I want to add, just even like thinking back to the question. So, barriers that prevent organizations from effectively managing and controlling their energy. And oftentimes, I do think it's the executives themselves that are preventing this. And why
Agreed.
I'm saying that is because, one, they're really focused on targets. So, something like John said in question one, 2050. Okay, we set that target and now we can move on and look at our next goal for the company. I think making long distance goals is always great, but I think making maybe a 2025 goal, a 2030 goal, a 2035 goal, all the goals in between to get you to that 2050 are really important. Another thing is, and I don't know how this is across the board, but I genuinely find that companies don't invest enough in improving their current business practices. And
Nailed
I
it.
and I think, like you mentioned, the capital work. We're so focused on new major projects that we tend to ignore all the cries from everyone saying, "Hey, what we're doing right now is not efficient and it's not working." And I think that that's something we definitely overlook. And I do wonder like when this shift was, because I do hear about, past times where things are working, and then of course we have had like a surge in retirees recently. So that does impact the workforce and how efficient we are, because we are losing institutional knowledge, which ultimately does impact efficiency, I would say. But I do think once we got into, having all these separate departments and all these silos, it's really become, hey, your job is this and you should focus on this.
yeah.
And you do this part and then you send it to this person and they continue it on. Whereas it feels like it used to be a bit more of a conversation and a bit more of a team environment. Whereas now we're all doing our job based on our job description and we're in this little box. And I
Yep.
really do find that's debilitating to not even just energy and carbon, but just overall company success.
Yeah, absolutely right, Lysandra. And I want to segue what you said, but it relates
Mhm.
to what John and I have been saying too. Is, we've talked about these tend to be transactions on
Mm.
the procurement and the engineering. They get new equipment but actually in energy and in carbon, because they're the same thing, you actually have to manage it continual. So
Mm.
when you're buying energy, did you buy too much or did you not buy enough? Like, don't, you should be looking at when you're putting equipment in, is that equipment actually commissioned properly? Is it actually
Yeah.
operating correctly? Is it being maintained correctly? There's no mechanisms within, again, starting from the C suite, not pushing this down, coming back to your point, it's not measured and managed. And everyone, as John mentions, in some fashion touches energy. So everyone should play a role in some capacity. You don't need to have these worldwide experts to do the work for you. You need this to be built into your culture, in summary.
Yeah,
Well,
it's interesting. You were touching on EVs, and I remember a discussion some time back before EVs were being thought about as being a thing, and somebody was talking about fuel efficiency with a car, and you know you're sat in a situation. You've got an option. There's various options. You can't afford to go out and buy the newest, most fuel efficient car. So do you say, well, there's nothing I can do? No, you look at the car that you've got, you make sure it's properly maintained, you consider how you drive it, and you perhaps do some
Mm-hmm.
alternatives to driving, and you manage that situation. You don't go, oh, I can't afford a new car. There's nothing I can do. You look at it, and I think I'm really intrigued with what you're saying, Lysandra, about the loss of institutional knowledge, because what that speaks to is an inability to capture some of those skills and knowledge and formalize it within the institution. Because in an ideal world, none of us should be indispensable. We should be able to, yeah, there may be a little bit of a bump in the road, but then there should be enough resilience in the organisation
Yeah.
with knowledge and everything else that it continue. And I think a barrier to energy is that the procedures and everything have not necessarily been set up. I can think of a well-known sports clothing brand, okay, and they have a very impressive uh, corporate statement on what they're going to do about the environment and everything else. You then look at audits done on their individual retail outlets, and after the outlet has been designed and set up, there's nothing taking place to actually control what's going on the energy side.
Mm.
It's because it's thought, oh, we've designed an effective, you know, and you've got to be careful in retail because so much of it is about what the store looks like.
Yeah.
But we've designed that. That's the job done. Let's walk away. It is what it, and it comes back to this thing again. Well, we've done everything we can. There's nothing else to do.
I do want to say this because I think we need to stress this. There is a business case that, like, when you put these pieces in place that we're describing, this is the best investment, best return that organizations can have. I mean, we've been saying this. I know Tom Wren, who is going to be released, our podcast with him, he's saying, like, people that are in the know that it's a great investment. It's just, as you said, John, they don't have the internal mechanism to actually do that and to measure that and
No,
to confirm the value of it. Sure.
and this needs to be thought about. That there's when you're doing big scale or thinking about carbon abatement and management and everything else, that there is a sort of an abatement curve that's, and I think our friends at McKinsey were the guys who came up with it. But it's a marginal cost abatement curve, and the idea of this is across a chart, you've got things that are either going to make you money, going to cost you money to implement, and then on this chart, the width of them shows the scope, and every one of those marginal abatement curves that is done, the thing that is the best investment is normally energy efficiency. But is it because what we're talking about is harder to do than going out and buying a new sexy piece of kit?
It's because it's different from what people have done.
Yeah.
It's not harder. It's just they buy new kits all the time, so they're pretty good at it. They just haven't done the energy piece, which, again, I believe will be the way of the future going forward.
Yeah.
Well, taking this global, in what ways does globalization impact the way corporations approach energy management? And are there notable differences in approaches across different industries or regions?
Right. I'm going to take this. I'll start this, John, because being
Okay.
North American, I have found firms that we talk to that are European or Japanese tend to be much further ahead in this thinking, and it starts from senior management. John kind of nailed it. It's reporting that drives. But I have seen a rather large French manufacturer. This was like 5, 7 years ago. It's a big name the plant manager knew what the carbon, there was a carbon charge that when they were developing projects, he had an internal carbon charge that he had to include when he was evaluating projects. Like that was 7 years ago. So I find Europeans, Asians, like the Japanese, are way ahead of the game in their thinking. Now, that being said, and John, I'll be interested in your point because you've had some exposure here. When North Americans get it and get it right, we can leapfrog. But the truth is, there's a lot of opportunity to leapfrog because there's not a lot of North
Yeah.
Americans that are on this. That's my take, John. Love to hear your thought based on your exposure in Europe and in North America.
Okay. I think, there's a couple of points I can make on this. Globalization, in some ways, has made a little bit of focus at higher level on energy issues because we are seeing that some corporations are perhaps deciding to invest in new facilities in, should we say, I'm going to build a new data center and I might well go and build it in British Columbia because
Where it's a
I can
clean grid, where
then
it's a very clean grid.
yeah. So I
Yeah.
think that happened because one of the things we have to bear in mind with the large global corporations, they may have their shares on the New York Stock Exchange, the London Stock Exchange. They may be headquartered in Milan or somewhere else, but they don't really have any loyalty to any one country in terms of business. And so they may flex what they do depending what the prevailing environment for energy is, and maybe the prevailing environment for regulation, which is that becomes an issue there. I think the other thing, certainly, I think there are two levers that vary in different regions. One is the basic cost of energy. Because if you're paying half for your electricity what somebody is in another jurisdiction, that's going to be an issue. And another big one, speaking as a country that was part of the European Union, but isn't any longer, I won't go off on that one. Personal view there.
Oh, UK based. Oh,
Yeah,
yeah.
you get, for example, Europe has put in far more regulation on energy and other aspects than other
Mm-hmm.
jurisdictions. So, for example, simple things like the energy rating of buildings that has been forced to be increased. Having energy ratings for appliances, all of that's been introduced, and that came in Europe. You mentioned Japan. Japan's big driver, of course, is very little intrinsic energy within the country. So they've had to rely on importing. So therefore, their focus comes not just on they haven't got it, but it's something that has to come across the trade barrier. So you get a different take on it that way. So I think you do get those things. But what is interesting is I think, and this is something I was looking at recently, there's beginning to becoming a little more of a levelling up on all of this, that the differences are becoming less distinct. And before we started on the podcast, you touched on the border mechanism, the carbon border mechanism in Europe. And that's interesting because they're going to say to you in North America, you want to export to Europe. If you haven't met our standards, we're going to charge you a tax. Now, the logic comes now that your government says, well, hold on a minute. Why don't we tax our businesses in our country to make them meet the European standards and we get the tax dollars, not the Europeans? So there is this levelling up that's occurring, and I think there is the sort of more globalization of regulation, but there will always be outlying
And,
countries. Yeah.
and John, when you talk about regulations, we're even talking about financial
Yes.
reporting to public corporations.
Yeah.
Now, there's a global requirement, or they're trying to make a global requirement, and it's impacting North America, Canada, and they're trying to standardize this to make sure that
Yeah.
makes that happen.
So I think that's one thing. But again, don't sit back and think it's all going to happen. And there is something to be said for for example, North America, looking at some of the regulation that comes in Europe, to give a heads up as to where your regulation might go. Because
Mm-hmm.
whilst in some
Great.
things Europe follows, I mean, in television, if you like, Europe follows what America does, but the other way around. So I think there's that. And the other part of the question was about industries. And I think there are clear differences there. And if we talk about the energy intensive industries, iron, steel, cement, and others like that, they have, I mean, we've had it in this country where steel has said, we will move unless something's done to help us with energy pricing. That's really hitting it big time. But when you've got 20-30% of your production cost is energy, you do take some note of it and you do something. But when you're in a normal office environment, financial services, something like that, your energy intensity may be 1 or 2%. And so why bother?
Yeah, I do want to pick up on that because on the energy intensive industries and the difference of pricing, and we hear frequently here in North America, maybe it's more of a Canadian thing, that our pricing is just like outlandish and there's no way we can compete. Again, listening to experts like Henning from Eurasia talking about, well, actually, our pricing is quite high, and some of our industries are leaders in the world. And now I do grant, and I don't want to. I think you're right. The energy intensive industries, that they can and are challenged, but I think, like, again, from my discussions with North Americans, because energy's been so cheap, they've never had to manage it. Because they've never had
Absolutely.
to manage it, all of a sudden when pricing goes up, oh, you're gonna, well, start managing it, man. Like, manage it. Don't just treat it as a transaction. And I think that's the big. Again, this is for executives. That's what they have to start thinking of. Like, this is doable with the right direction to focus.
Yeah, it's interesting you're saying about the regional differences. I can remember first time I came to North America and I was thinking, wow, your gas prices, that they're half of what ours are. And then I was thinking about this and I went, yes, but our fuel economy of our cars is twice what yours is. So actually, we're both spending the same to go the same journey.
Yeah, and John, that's a great analogy of what manufacturing or industry should be thinking too. Is if you're driven to it, you'll make the change, right? You
Yeah,
will make the change.
yeah. The
John,
imperative.
having you on the pod.
Yeah, go on.
Sorry. I was going to say, having you on the podcast and also having anytime we have any experts come on, either from Europe or other experts that work quite often with Europe, it's really interesting because it's shifted my perspective on something. And that's, I really take energy availability for granted here in North America. I think when I visited Europe, that was really evident. Like, even just, you think when you leave your hotel room, you take out your card and all the energy in the room is off.
Yep.
Like, we don't have anything like that. We can leave everything running and everything on, and it doesn't matter. And that's because we in North America typically have an abundant supply of energy and we
Yeah.
don't have any limits to it. We consistently have access to it. Again, it's not priced outrageously, so typically people can afford it. Whereas in Europe, it's a completely different lifestyle because of the situation that you're in. And as humans, we typically are driven by need. So unfortunately, I find because in North America we don't need to be more efficient, we won't be more efficient. So it's
Yeah.
really a big ask because we're asking people to do things because they want to or because they should at this time. Because at this, there's no legal need. There's a bit of financial need, right, to decrease your costs and things like that. But that's not typically, like you both mentioned, what people look at first.
Yeah.
Lysandra, you're again, it's perfect. I recently, because I was doing some analysis for taxes for myself, and I looked at all my utility expenses. And do you know the most expensive utility was my TV? It was like
Mm.
almost twice to three times of
Yeah.
my electrical. And
Wow.
yeah, and do you hear people? Yeah, you hear the odd people complain, but we seem to pay for that. And then when the electrical costs go up or gas costs go up, people, I'm thinking, we seem to have it wrong. Like, I think
Mm.
you're right. We take it for granted, we expect it. And so, yes, I think that changes our thinking, how we
But
act.
we all do that. Here's another example. Something I've been involved in outside work is water and sanitation for the third world or the developing world, whichever's the correct term at the moment. And here's the thing: you've got the same as us. You you go to the bathroom and you flush, and what do you flush with? Top quality drinking water, and we
Yes.
don't think a thing of it because water, clean water for us in
Abundance.
our developed economies, it's a given. We expect it, and I think that's one of the things, Lysandra. I think you have touched on right. Countries that experience brownouts and blackouts and interruptions in supply take energy far more seriously. I mean, we all, UK, North America, we expect to come in the evening to a house that's warm. We flick a switch and the lights come on. That's what happens. So yes, and I think possibly, and we haven't talked on this, but I do wonder whether the how people see energy and treat energy at home, how that influences them, how they are at work.
Actually, we actually have studied that, John, and it makes a huge difference. In fact, what we will do is when we're working with organizations, we actually are giving them information so they can actually this is the employees, so they can do something at home.
Yeah,
And we found that if they start doing something at home, they'll bring this through to the business. Again,
yeah.
if it's properly set up. The other difference, though, at home, they're paying for the bill and they see it. When
Or
you're in a
do they?
business,
Now,
yeah.
now
Well,
here's
Val, okay, good point, John.
Now, I'm going to pick you up on it because I've done a similar thing with trying to engage people with home and work. And I don't know if you get the same thing here, but very often people are getting their utilities on what we might call a budget account. You pay so many dollars a month, and at the end of the year, you settle up whichever way it is. And you say to somebody, how much? And I mean, it's interesting. What do you spend on utilities? And I've had this in a workshop where I've had a woman who said, I don't know, my husband pays the bill. I've had a man who says, I
Yeah,
don't know, my partner pays the bill. And I've had other people
yeah,
say, oh, I pay £200 a month. I've got no idea what it is, where it's going. But because, it manages it nicely to pay these nice even payments. And you know what?
that's a
Because
good
of that,
point.
the bill comes in and they don't, all they look at is not how much they've used, but are they in credit or debit? So, yeah,
Yeah, that's a very good point.
I think it relates to the fact that we don't really have a standard, right? Like if I looked at my bill and it said, this is what an efficient home should be using, maybe I would be more prone to being more efficient, right? But if you don't have a baseline and you don't have an understanding, how can you be more efficient? What is your goal? How do you know
yeah.
it's achievable?
There's been some pilot studies done on trying to put on a utility bill, telling people what the average spend in their neighbourhood is,
Mm,
so that you get the idea. We have a thing from our regulator. There is a sort of the average household, and they say what that should be spending. But the thing is, if
right.
you're spending less than that, you go, that's fine, I'm all right. You don't bother
Well,
looking.
that's the thing, right? I don't think average is the best way to go. I would
No,
say it's efficiency, right?
yeah,
Like, I don't think it should be by neighborhood. I don't think any
no,
of that because, again, we've all become so accustomed to our energy usage.
yeah.
Yeah.
This is the thing. We live in. I mean, people talk about industrial revolutions, agricultural revolutions, or
Mm,
whatever, but we live in a society that is totally dependent on energy, and yet people don't. give energy the due regard that it should be.
including the executives.
Yeah, because the executives, after all, are regular people. Now, I think we must speak up for some of the executives here. One, there are the ones out there that are doing a great job, but equally there are the others out there. There is so much competing with them that they don't know what to do. Now, I found this interesting. I've said to you, I'm doing some training work, and we're looking at training people building up projects to present to review boards within a large corporation. And one of the things that's interesting that's come out of this is something that this organisation is doing. They do not want just a single scenario presented. So let's say you're looking at a project and you're going to say, okay, we want to head for a decarbonisation target. They want actually for the project proposers to put a number of scenarios together and show, even if it's not cost effective, what it would take to get to the net to the zero by 2050, just so that the executives can look at that and go, so that's what the gap is. That's where we've got to go. Whereas I think in the past it would be a simple case. You just had to make the case on the project, on its current situation. Does it make us money? Does it not? Is it part of the corporate plan? Is it not? So there is light there. There are things happening, but nowhere near enough.
John, I want to pick up on what you said. So that this is about decarbonization plan. Do they talk about energy or managing energy in that decarbonization plan?
Yes, they do.
Okay, good.
Yeah,
That's great.
but can I say? Can I say this is? I don't want to go. I don't want to use the word exceptional, but I'm going to say it's not the most common. And I do feel
Right.
again, and I think this is a fair point to make for the C-suite. For some C-suites, sustainability is paying the wage bill next year.
Yes.
It's staying in business in the short term.
Yes.
But if you always concentrate on the short term, you actually won't have a long term business.
Okay. I want to pick up on this. I talked about procurement, finance. I talked about engineering, but now you have sustainability people that have this requirement. There's a role. That's their role. That is their role. That's no one else needs to do it. It's their role. They're looking at carbon emission side, and again, unfortunately, many of them are really bright, great people, but they don't have the energy exposure or literacy, so they don't focus on the biggest area of ways of reducing carbon emissions. They will default to what suppliers or other people are saying are popular, which, by the way, from my experience, isn't always the best priority or options to do, but they don't know that because they don't have that knowledge base to actually figure that out.
Yeah.
All right, our last question. How do changing consumer preferences and stakeholder expectations, particularly around environmental sustainability, influence the need for corporations to prioritize energy management as a strategic imperative?
Wow.
They
What a
don't.
question.
They don't.
You don't
I
think
mean,
so?
well, the reason I say that is that we need consumers and stakeholders that understand why energy management should be something that should be looked at as well as as part of sustainability. I think it is good. We do see companies reporting to their stakeholders. For example, I'm thinking I've got a report sitting over on the desk there, and the company saying things like, and it's interesting, that they are now 100% of the electricity in the buildings they own is supplied from approved renewable electricity. Clearly, they feel that there's a requirement for that. They haven't said, and in the same time, we've increased our energy efficiency by 20% or anything like that, because I don't think the average stakeholder and the average customer looks at this. You know, you're going into Starbucks, excuse me, and You might question them on their fair trade. You might question them on throwing away coffee cups and everything else. How many people walk into a Starbucks store, and I'm just picking on Starbucks, could be anyone, but how many of them go in there and go, well, this store doesn't seem very energy efficient?
Yeah, I am in total agreement, John. If you look, because we were doing this like 6 or 8 months ago, we were looking at financial statements, or sorry, their annual reports. And
Mm,
they would have reports on environmental. But the truth is, the KPIs, they were really not very sticky, or again, knowing what we know in the industry, and you like efficiency, how did they, nothing stated of the such. I think I would say there's a shout though. I think, and I haven't looked at it this year, I'll be interested to know. Maple Leaf Foods here in Canada did have a very rigorous, I don't know if they still do, but they had a very rigorous reporting that would go into efficiency, carbon emissions. Like they went into quite detail. So there was some merit. It would be interesting to see if that's still the case. I have to check, but it's you can tell a lot by their annual reports of what they put in it and what they don't put in it. And so
yeah.
I'm reinforcing what John said. I don't think they do it.
Yeah, I mean, here in the UK, we have a thing for large companies called Streamline Energy and Carbon Reporting, which requires you to report your energy use and your scope 1 and 2 carbon emissions in your annual report and compare them with, as in standard accounting, with what they were in the previous year. Yeah, these are small edges. These are small edges. And I have, and it's quite interesting. I dealt with a company that had to do this reporting for the first time and did the number crunching for them. And then I said, and of course, you need to put a narrative in this report about what you've done in regard to reducing your carbon footprint and improving your energy efficiency. And it was quite interesting what they came back with as to what they thought with it. And I had to go back with their list of sort of bullet points and say, can you strike the last three out, because they've got absolutely nothing to do with either energy use or your carbon footprint. But I think, and I'm not going to jump ahead to what's our takeaway at this point, but I think something that's underlying a lot of what we've talked about is people's knowledge, education, and awareness of the role that energy has to take.
Well, to end off this episode, and I don't know where the heck we went this episode, but to end it off, remember, we started this with navigating energy management in corporate boardrooms. So, what is the biggest takeaway for our listeners?
Okay, I'll have.
Right.
Are you going first or me?
You go first. John. No. You go first, because I think you had actually, I thought that it was a perfect response that you had before the question. So go ahead.
Yeah. Having given the response I gave before the question, I am going to give. Another one, and the biggest takeaway is the C-suite needs to become energy literate and make sure that somebody is managing energy as a strategic issue.
Okay, can I add, or I think they have to deem energy as controllable. I think it has to be stated. I think they need to make departments accountable and responsible in using energy. And I think it has to be part of the organization's performance. And I know that's not done, but I actually think the way the world's going, because of this transition, this transformation, is driven because of energy, it will be a need. And the sooner people get on that and think that way, the better it will be. And the last part is, and I've emphasized this many times, John and I, that there is a business case and a significant return to do so. And it's not just buying equipment. It's behavioral, operational changes that people should be doing day in and day out. And when you do that and you measure it, and you've got to measure it and give feedback, you will see it's a fantastic return, and you'll wonder why you didn't ever do it before.
I think my biggest takeaway on navigating energy management in C-suites is making sure that you have tangible goals within the time that you are on the C-suite.
Valid point.
Yeah, how long is that?
How long would that be? Well, hold on here. Can I? So, yeah, I put my targets for 2050. I'm good. I'm only going to be here 3 years. I'm good for
Nope,
that.
within the time that you're there. I want a 3-year goal.
Okay. Okay. Really good point.
Yeah,
Yeah.
excellent
All
point.
right, Dave, John, thanks for a great episode.
Thanks, guys. I
It's
had a lot
been
of fun
fun.
with this one.
Yeah, thank you.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360 Energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts. See you next week.